Have you ever felt like within yourself, there are actually multiple other selves that each navigate a different part of your life? Well then, let me introduce you to Mariana Ortega and her concept of the multiplicitous self. Ortega understands the importance of recognizing that the self isn't singular. In fact, we have multiple versions of ourselves that appear in different circumstances. I might be one self right now, but in 20 minutes when I go hang out with some friends, a different self might be reactivated in me, and I might become that version of myself. And Ortega, like many other Latina feminist philosophers, looks at how this experience particularly affects individuals in marginalized groups. People of color, people who exist on the borderlands, people on the margins. So my existence as a multiplicitous self is amplified by the fact that I'm a Black woman. Ortega's concept of the multiplicitous self builds upon philosophies from other Latina feminists like Maria Lugones and Gloria Anzaldúa, who seek to explore the liminality which marginalized individuals experience due to their marginal position between worlds. She emphasizes the multiplicity and complexity of the self, which leads to a constant state of in-betweenness for the multiplicitous self. Ortega develops her concept of the multiplicitous self by drawing on two other philosophies. First, she uses Martin Heidegger's existential philosophy and his concept of Dasein, which translates to being there. Heidegger sees the self as being in the world, and his conception of the self contrasts to that which is found in Cartesian philosophy, wherein the self is seen as a thinking thing. Selves are situated and fundamentally engaged in the world for Heidegger, rather than observing it as an abstract mind. The other philosophy Ortega turns to is that of Latina feminist philosophy, with a focus on Gloria Anzaldúa and Maria Lugones. She examines Anzaldúa's concept of the new mestiza and what this conception of the self says about the liminal experience of marginalized selves, and what Lugones' concept of world traveling reveals about how multiplicitous selves exist in different worlds. She brings these two very different philosophies together because Heidegger's philosophy offers an explanation of selfhood, but his analysis doesn't account for the experience of selves that lie on the margins or at the borders, while Latina philosophers specifically depict this within their philosophies. Together, they help us understand the characteristics of the multiplicitous self. The first characteristic of the multiplicitous self is that it is a self in the making. This is a similarity shared between Heidegger and Anzaldúa's philosophies. Heidegger's philosophy is an existentialist one, meaning that he adopts the view that existence precedes essence. And thus, a human being has no essential essence, but instead creates their own essence through their individual actions and decisions. Existence means projecting ourselves onto new possibilities, and both the new mestiza and Dasein embrace this projection. In this act of projection, they come to make themselves through their choices. The second characteristic, which is also a similarity shared between Anzaldúa and Heidegger, is that the self is thrown, or it's always already in the world. For Dasein and the new mestiza, this is connected to a mood of anxiety that permeates their lives. For Heidegger, anxiety is the mood that makes Dasein feel not at home, but it also allows for the possibility of self-awareness. So, through anxiety, Dasein can learn to live an authentic existence. For Anzaldúa, anxiety is connected to the possibility of choice, and the new mestiza is always having to make difficult choices because she's constantly in a liminal position. Both Heidegger and Anzaldúa understand that anxiety is part of being human, and a way of answering the existential call to create one's own essence through action and choices. Another characteristic, again shared with Anzaldúa and Heidegger, is that the multiplicitous self is a rejection of the subject-object dichotomy. Philosophical accounts that posit subject-object divides don't accurately explain how the self exists in the world. These accounts allow for the possibility of self to doubt the existence of outside world and other minds. Heidegger disagrees with this. Instead, he offers a conception of the self that already stands outside, that is always in the world. Anzaldúa also rejects the dichotomy. Her and other Latina feminists criticize views of worlds that are arranged in terms of dualities. A consequence of this is the narrowing of possibilities. The individual is forced to choose just one side of the duality instead of embracing them both and understanding how they're interrelated. The next characteristic comes from Lugones' idea of being at ease in a world. Lugones describes how having an understanding of the norms of a world and the language and history of the world are all things that contribute to being at ease in it. Ortega expands on this idea, calling it the ability to be non-reflective about everyday norms. Not being at ease in a world might look like culture shocks. An example that Ortega uses is that in Nicaragua, where she grew up, it was customary to greet people by kissing them on the cheek. But when she did this when she arrived in the US, she was met with weird and uncomfortable reactions. This added to her sense of not being at ease in the world. For me, as someone who inhabits multiple worlds, one of those worlds being an American world and another being a Ghanaian world, I sometimes feel the sense of not being at ease when I travel between worlds. Like, when I'm doing most things, I don't particularly think about which hand I'm doing it with, because that's not a concern in the American world I exist in. But when I go back to Ghana, I have to be reminded all the time that with my left hand, I shouldn't shake hands, eat, or even hand something to someone else, because it's seen as rude. This can contribute to my sense of not being at ease, because I forget about the customs of the world. Ortega actually expands on Lugones' concept of being at ease to account for different levels of not being at ease. She says that there are thin and thick senses of not being at ease. For the thin sense, the ruptures to everyday life that one experiences are minimal, and they don't have a very significant effect. So me forgetting that I shouldn't use my left hand, it's pretty thin because it doesn't have that significant an effect on me. But with thick senses of not being at ease, there's a deeper sense of unfamiliarity, and it has a more substantial effect on the individual. I felt this deeper discomfort when I first moved to England, and I didn't understand some of the slang that my friends used or the things that they referenced, which all made me feel completely out of place. Like, when I first heard the phrase, "that's a shout," I was so confused. Like, firstly, why are we shouting? And secondly, I just asked you if you want to get dessert. How's that a response to my question? So something like that is a deeper sense of not being at ease. So it's more thick because I felt completely out of place in these circumstances because it felt like we were speaking a different language. And so it made me feel so far out of this world. For Ortega, being in worlds is a key existential characteristic of the multiplicitous self and captures the complexity of the self. Ortega defines the multiplicitous self as a singular self occupying multiple social locations and a condition of in-betweenness. She pairs Lugones' concept of world with Heidegger's existential phenomenology to highlight the existential dimension of the life of the multiplicitous self. Ortega emphasizes that Lugones' conception of worlds underscores that worlds are always open to interpretation and reinterpretation. By adding Heidegger's account of being in the world, she sheds light on the fact that the worlds which one inhabits are intimately connected to the self, and it's necessary to consider the ways in which selves exist in these worlds. Ortega argues that because the self is multiplicitous, it has different social identities, and it is capable of being in multiple worlds. She employs Heidegger's concept of being in worlds here because when moving between worlds, the multiplicitous self is aware of how the self fares in the specific world that they're in. She adds to this world the notion of being between worlds. It's possible to be in various worlds, but one can also be between worlds, and the multiplicitous self constantly remains between worlds. The multiplicitous self is acutely aware of the experience of liminality. This is something discussed by both Anzaldúa and Lugones, liminality being a key part of both of their philosophies. And Ortega captures it through this idea of being between worlds. Being in worlds captures the ability that the multiplicitous self has to access and inhabit several worlds. And it is tied to being between worlds because the self isn't always just occupying a single world. For most multiplicitous selves, their everyday way of being is being between worlds, existing in multiple worlds at once. For me, as a multiplicitous self, I'm never just inhabiting one world. There's no point at which I'm, for example, just in the American world. Just because I'm sitting down in California right now doesn't mean that that's the only world I'm inhabiting. I'm also inhabiting the British world through the vocabulary I'm using, and inhabiting the Ghanaian world because these bracelets on my wrist, some of which that have my Ghanaian name, are a constant reminder of my culture. I am between all of these worlds at once and forever moving between them. But the key difference between Ortega and Lugones is, as I mentioned a moment ago, Ortega defines the multiplicitous self as a singular self occupying multiple social locations and a condition of in-betweenness. The self isn't only multiple, it is both multiple and singular. There's only one self for Ortega. This is why she uses the term multiplicity and not plurality. So even though the self is singular, it is also in multiple worlds, as opposed to Lugones' view that we have multiple selves for the multiple worlds that we are a part of. For Ortega, it's just the one self that is between these multiple worlds at all times. But Ortega also emphasizes that there are risks, which come with being a part of multiple worlds. And unfortunately, multiplicitous selves are in some ways limited by their perpetual positioning between worlds. Some worlds may share many characteristics and norms because there's a large overlap, while others will share very few characteristics. This affects how individuals move between worlds. The power relations in a given world shape the way that the individual is constructed in said world, and this differs according to worlds and informs the extent to which the individual has to world travel. Things may also be lost as the individual moves between worlds. It isn't possible to completely translate the self across worlds, and this means that, in some senses, the multiplicitous self will always be an outsider, no matter what world they're in. Ortega also notes the relevance of adding intersectionality into this discussion. She draws on ideas from key intersectional thinkers like Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. She emphasizes that we shouldn't see our social identities as separable or as additive. Rather, they're intermeshed. She says that the experience of the multiplicitous self as being between worlds and being in worlds is informed by intersecting social identities, but highlights that one must have a decentered perspective. She emphasizes that there's no identity that's a priori central. There's not one social identity that trumps the others. Yes, in some circumstances, certain identities will be more salient than others, but this doesn't mean that there's one identity that is one true self to which the others are secondary. After all, it's called the multiplicitous self. So it's important to recognize the multiplicity of the self in terms of one's identities as well as the self's capability to exist between worlds. Ortega's theory of the multiplicitous self expands and builds upon prior theories which aim to understand selfhood and marginalized existence. Her view provides a fresh take on the liminality which prior Latina feminist philosophers discuss, and it accounts for how I can be both Araba and Kristen, and in fact how I constantly remain between the two. It also emphasizes the key existential nature of the multiplicitous self and how we make ourselves through our actions. So, if you didn't understand why you felt like there were multiple selves within your individual self, I hope Ortega, myself, and my many bracelets were able to help you understand and answer that question.